Travis Hunt didn't move out to the edge of a county jurisdiction to be left alone. He did it to stay in control. Control over his land, his time, his peace. He had spent over 2 decades building up a solid waste logistics business from scratch, not because he loved trash, but because he understood what people threw away told you more than what they kept. It was a dirty business, but it paid clean, and by the time he turned 53, he didn't owe a soul anything. That's when he sold most of it off, retained only the specialized license for environmental transport, and bought an old 32-acre ranch on the southern ridge of Cumberland Valley. The property was technically outside the limits of local residential zoning, but close enough to town that certain types of attention still seeped through the fence lines. Nosy surveyors, unsolicited flyers from land acquisition firms, and, more recently, the sudden formation of a community improvement board by a group of newer homeowners who'd moved into the area just a year prior. The gate was Travis's first real act of defiance, though he never saw it that way. It was an industrial-grade, steel-framed piece with composite cladding, custom-built, electronically locking, and anchored in reinforced concrete that could stop a moving truck. It wasn't just for show. There had been issues early on with people dumping debris on the edge of his property, and one night a rusted-out pickup truck was found abandoned near the southern line, stripped and torched. That incident alone justified the added security, and he went through the correct legal channels to ensure everything was up to spec. The locking mechanism incorporated a passive infrared motion sensor and a fail-safe electromagnetic bolt, both powered by an off-grid solar battery array. To top it off, he'd installed a non-lethal deterrent inside the gate's internal housing, a compressed gas capsule, the kind used in wildlife control units, which triggered a burst of tear gas if the gate's main latch was struck with enough force to be considered an attempted breach. It wasn't paranoia. It was planning. For months, things were quiet. Travis kept to his schedule, morning patrol on foot, checking fence integrity and trail cams, then 2 hours managing permits for his smaller transport contracts, usually involving regulated scrap haul-outs. By mid-afternoon, he worked on the main house or one of the side sheds. The ranch needed work, but that's part of what he liked about it. Restoration was its own kind of therapy. Sometimes neighbors passed on the main road and waved. He nodded, didn't wave back, but he wasn't rude. He simply didn't believe every greeting meant friendship, and he'd learned that waving too easily gave people the wrong idea about your boundaries. Then came the letter. Not an envelope. A letter, folded in half, shoved into the side of the gate, held there by a small rock. The paper was laser-printed, not handwritten, with a crisp heading. Cumberland Hill Committee. Notice of aesthetic violation. There was no official stamp, no county seal, nothing that even remotely suggested authority. But the language was unmistakably forceful. The visual character of your entry structure fails to conform to the environmental tone established by the community consensus. Community consensus. Travis remembered saying those words aloud in the middle of the road and laughing once, just once, because it sounded like something from a badly written novel. He'd never been asked for his input. No one had called. No one had knocked on his door. They just appointed themselves a voice and decided he was the problem. Travis didn't respond at first. He did what any property owner would do. He scanned the letter, emailed it to his attorney on retainer, and asked for a full statute reference regarding their so-called committee. A day later, the reply confirmed what he suspected. The group was informal, had no regulatory authority, and could not enforce design compliance on parcels outside the residential overlay. That included Travis's land. In short, they could complain, but they couldn't compel. So he let it go. Ignored it. Moved on. But that's never how these things stop. The next week, a neighbor he barely knew, a man named Carl who recently moved in with his wife and a landscaping crew, approached the gate and stood there for several minutes. Didn't ring the buzzer. Didn't call out. Just stood with his hands on his hips, staring up at the gate like he was trying to decode a secret message. Travis saw him through the long-range camera mounted in a stone pillar 20 feet away. He didn't confront him. He just watched. And when Carl finally walked back to his SUV and drove off, Travis rewound the footage, archived it, and marked it with the date. It was the silence that followed that felt heavier than the stares or letters. Nothing happened for 10 days. Then, suddenly, the motion log pinged an alert at 2:13 a.m. Someone had approached the gate, not a car. Footsteps. The camera showed 2 figures in plain dark clothing, no visible markings, no tools in hand, just slow movements, circling. One of them touched the latch. Then came the jolt. The force was just enough to activate the tamper mechanism. A burst of white vapor expelled through the interior release valve, flooding the air in a cone-shaped radius. The figures recoiled instantly. One dropped to a knee, the other staggered back, clutching at his face. Less than 30 seconds later, they were gone, retreating down the gravel road on foot. Travis didn't pursue them. He didn't shout or fire a warning shot. He reviewed the footage again, flagged the frame where the latch was struck, then called the sheriff's office and logged the incident. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't suggest names. He simply stated what had occurred and that it had been captured on film. They said they'd send someone out in the morning to take a statement. He agreed. Then he went to bed. When the deputy arrived the next morning, Travis handed him a USB stick with the footage and a printout of the sensor logs. The deputy watched a portion of the video on a field laptop, asked a few questions, and scribbled some notes. "Non-lethal gas release?" he asked. Travis nodded. "Certified. Documentation's in my office. Want a copy?" The deputy waved it off. "If they file a complaint, we'll follow up. Right now, sounds like your system did its job." It should have ended there. But 2 days later, a gray SUV with municipal tags pulled up to the gate at noon. 3 men stepped out wearing matching khaki polos with District Inspection Unit stitched over the breast pocket. No one called ahead, no warrant. One of them held a clipboard and pointed at the gate like he was explaining something to a trainee. The lead man pushed the buzzer once, then again. Travis didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his phone and called his lawyer. They weren't inspectors. That was confirmed. Within the hour. The city had no record of a visit scheduled for that area, and the vehicle tags, once cross-checked, belonged to a leased fleet under a third-party corporate logistics entity. One previously linked to land development operations in eastern counties. What did that mean? It meant someone with real money and connections was trying to apply soft pressure. Not through courts, not through officials, through intimidation and confusion. Travis didn't blink. He requested an injunction that same afternoon, had his counsel issue a cease and desist warning to all adjacent property groups, and contacted an accredited security company to conduct a counter-surveillance sweep. No confrontations, no drama, just process. But something in his gut shifted that day. He wasn't just being watched, he was being selected, and whatever they thought he would do, back down, sell, remove his gate, they were about to learn who they were dealing with. It was the 4th morning after the SUV incident, when Travis noticed something different. Not dramatic, not immediately alarming, but out of place in a way that struck his instincts harder than any loud noise or broken object might have. His driveway, the main one leading from the eastern gate down toward the shed and house, had been tampered with. Not destroyed, not blocked, just uneven. A shallow trench, barely noticeable unless you knew how the gravel was supposed to settle, ran across the width of the path like someone had dragged a weight sideways through it. At first, he assumed it could have been runoff from the late-night rain earlier that week, but upon closer inspection, he saw that the edges of the trench were too clean, too defined. More importantly, there were boot prints. 2 pairs, heavy-soled. One set smaller, thinner, with a pointed heel like the kind worn by private contractors or off-duty security personnel. They hadn't gone all the way up to the house. They'd stopped at the utility junction box near the shed, lingered there, He could tell by the scuffed pattern in the gravel, then circled back. Travis didn't call the sheriff this time. He took photos, measured the spacing between prints, and compared them to the ones from the gate incident. He knew better than to assume anything just yet. Instead of reacting, he acted. He disconnected the shed's power manually, rerouted the line through an emergency conduit he had installed years earlier for backup power. After that, he locked the shed's internal access panel with a reinforced bar and keypad lock. Then he reviewed his motion logs for the past 3 nights. The camera on the far west tree line, which rarely triggered unless deer wandered through, had been deactivated for 6 hours the night prior. The feed wasn't corrupted, it was blank, offline. Someone had used a signal jammer. That wasn't just casual mischief or curious kids poking around. That was intentional disruption. Someone testing his boundaries, his response time, his patterns. Later that afternoon, while going over logistics files for his next transport job, he received a call, not from the sheriff, not from his lawyer, but from someone claiming to be with the Residential Compliance Enforcement Board. The voice was calm, even professional, though there was a hint of forced politeness that reminded Travis of used car salesmen. The caller stated that a follow-up review had been conducted on his property and that a formal assessment was scheduled for the following Monday. When Travis asked under what jurisdiction this board operated, the voice hesitated slightly, then explained that the board was an inter-property cooperative council formed to ensure all neighboring lots conformed to shared regional aesthetic and safety norms. Travis asked again, jurisdiction, statute, legal precedent. The voice responded with generalities, community cohesion, beautification initiatives, regional oversight goals. Nothing legal, nothing binding. It was all theater. He hung up, after warning the caller not to contact him again without legal authority. Then he called his lawyer and reported the interaction. That same evening, he drafted a notice of trespass with a lawyer-approved addendum that explicitly listed known third-party property associations and private security contractors. He laminated 3 copies, posted them at each entrance, and filed the document with the local recorder's office the next morning. His message was clear. Any future unauthorized presence on his land wouldn't be treated as a misunderstanding. It would be documented and prosecuted. And yet, the following day, a new event unfolded, stranger than any before. Around 10:40 a.m., while Travis was out back clearing brush from the lower tree line, he heard the sound of tires grinding against gravel at the front gate. Not an unusual sound by itself, but the timing was odd. Mid-morning on a weekday, no expected deliveries. He pulled out his phone and opened the live camera feed. 2 vehicles, one white, one black, both unmarked SUVs. 4 men in total. One stood at the gate's keypad panel, another by the side hinge, and the other 2 watched the perimeter, each holding short-range radios. None wore uniforms. None displayed visible identification. They weren't trying to speak through the intercom. They were analyzing the gate, measuring it. One even held a clipboard and gestured toward the support posts like he was conducting an appraisal. Travis remained where he was for several minutes, watching through the zoom lens on his handheld monitor. The man at the hinge pulled a small crowbar from his tool bag and tapped it lightly against the steel mount. Nothing aggressive yet, but it was a touch too close to forced entry. Travis toggled the remote audio and spoke through the speaker embedded near the keypad. His voice was calm, firm. "You're on private property. You have 60 seconds to leave before this is treated as a coordinated breach and I contact law enforcement." The man at the hinge froze. The others turned toward the speaker, their expressions unreadable. Then one of them raised his hands in a mock-friendly gesture. "We're just here to inspect a potential safety hazard," he said aloud. There was a report filed about a dangerous locking system. Travis didn't reply. He didn't need to. At that moment, he activated the external warning signal, a loud, intermittent beeping sound accompanied by a flashing red light mounted to the left side of the gate's structure. It didn't engage the tear gas. It was just a deterrent, designed to warn without consequence. But the reaction it triggered was telling. The man with the crowbar immediately dropped it. One of the others reached toward his waistband. Not for a badge, for a weapon, a semi-automatic sidearm half-holstered under his jacket. Travis caught the movement instantly and hit the emergency call button on his secured line. It routed directly to the sheriff's dispatch center, alerting them to an armed presence at his front gate. Within 10 minutes, a patrol vehicle arrived. Blue lights flashing, sirens off. The SUV occupants didn't flee. Instead, they stood calmly, arms folded, waiting. When the deputy stepped out, he approached them first. There was a brief exchange, quiet but tense. Then the deputy turned and approached the gate, requesting to speak with the property owner. Travis opened the line again, confirming his name and citing the ongoing harassment and attempted forced entry. He also informed the deputy that the men had attempted to dismantle a component of the gate and that one had been visibly armed. The deputy nodded, took notes, and returned to the group. They left 5 minutes later. No arrests, no citations. But their departure wasn't victory. It was warning. That evening, Travis's lawyer confirmed what Travis already suspected. The individuals were not affiliated with any official inspection agency. Their vehicle registration traced back to a contracting firm, previously employed in multiple eminent domain property seizures. The same firm had been linked indirectly to urban redevelopment projects that often relied on pressure tactics to gain land access, particularly for road widening or infrastructure rerouting. The lawyer's voice was flat, serious. They're testing how far they can push without legal retaliation. You need to be ready for escalation. Travis didn't hesitate. That night, he disabled the tear gas mechanism and replaced it with a newer model. Quieter, more targeted, and with internal tracking that sent real-time alerts to both his phone and a secure off-site server. He wasn't looking to hurt anyone. But if someone struck that gate again, they'd trigger a chain of evidence that would be indisputable in any courtroom. He walked the perimeter twice before dawn, checking every motion sensor, every floodlight, every trigger plate he'd buried months ago under a thin layer of dirt and crushed stone. Then he returned to the house, brewed strong coffee, and sat down to log the incident with timestamps, annotated screenshots, and full legal citations to accompany a formal complaint. He knew now this wasn't just about his gate. It never had been. The morning it finally escalated began deceptively quiet, the kind of stillness that suggested a break in pressure rather than its absence. Travis had risen early, made a quick sweep of the eastern boundary with his field monitor in one hand and a worn thermos of coffee in the other. The weather was dry, which helped visibility, and the soil around his perimeter was undisturbed. He noted that the backup motion detectors had all pinged on their scheduled resets, and nothing unusual showed up on the heat log. For the first time in a week, he allowed himself a brief moment of calm, thinking maybe the legal filings and documented complaints had finally done what they were supposed to. Establish a wall, not just physical, but procedural. That illusion held until exactly 10:07 a.m., when the long-range camera at the front gate picked up movement. It wasn't the usual curious vehicle or a lost delivery driver. It was a convoy. 2 black SUVs, both with tinted windows and identical decals bearing the acronym of a private asset management firm Travis didn't recognize, led the line. Behind them, a city-issue pickup with a mounted light rack and an unmarked white cargo van, slightly rusted near the lower panels, clearly not new. The vehicles didn't stop at the edge of the public easement. They continued down the gravel toward the gate as though they had every right in the world to be there, and when they arrived, the first SUV didn't even hesitate. It bumped the gate gently, not hard enough to break it, but enough to send a vibration through the post anchors, enough to wake the sensors and trigger a minor lock reinforcement cycle. Inside his house, Travis's alarm tone, a low, single pulse he'd chosen for its clarity, hummed once. He checked the feed. 4 men exited. The vehicles. 3 from the SUVs, 1 from the van. All were dressed in what Travis could only call tactical business wear. pressed khakis, utility belts without obvious firearms, black gloves. One of them carried a small handheld radio with a dish-like receiver. Not standard security equipment. It looked military surplus, something repurposed for signal location or jamming. That confirmed it. They weren't just there to intimidate. They were actively probing. One of them walked to the keypad, stared into the camera for a full 10 seconds, then reached out and pressed the call button. When Travis answered through the speaker, the man's voice came through in measured, practiced English. He introduced himself as Darren Hughes, a compliance officer representing the Regional Property Adjustment Authority, an entity Travis had never heard of, and one that, as his attorney would later confirm, did not exist in any official database. Hughes explained calmly and with mock concern that Travis's gate was under review as a potential barrier to civic accessibility, citing vague concerns about emergency vehicle access, environmental runoff, and potential encroachments on undeveloped public right-of-way. Travis didn't engage. He simply stated, for the record, that no authorization had been granted for inspection, entry, or evaluation, and that the group was now trespassing on a privately registered parcel, fully documented with the county. Hughes responded with a thin smile, barely audible through the video feed, and said, "We understand, Mr. Hunt. Unfortunately, lack of cooperation will result in corrective action." Within seconds, the man with the signal device raised it toward the gate and pressed something. The feed flickered. Not a full disruption, but a compression artifact like interference. Travis knew the device wasn't meant to shut down the system entirely, just enough to delay a trigger, reduce recording quality, interrupt signal timestamps. While the video wavered, another man approached the gate and reached for the weld line at the joint where the frame met the hinge. He produced a flat crowbar, exactly like the one from a week before, and jabbed it against the steel. A sharp metallic clank rang out, and that was enough. The impact wasn't strong, but it crossed the threshold Travis had calibrated the system to detect. Force with malicious intent. The gas system activated. From the center seam of the gate, a narrow burst of tear gas hissed outward in a low arc, catching the man directly in the chest. He staggered back, arms raised, coughing violently. The other two took a step forward, perhaps unsure of what had just occurred, until the second burst triggered. This one horizontal, low to the ground, enveloping the air around their legs and driving them into immediate retreat. Travis remained on the line with dispatch, reporting the gas release and repeating, calmly but firmly, that the release had been non-lethal, certified and triggered by an act of forced entry. As the four men retreated to their vehicles, one of them reached into his coat. Travis couldn't tell if it was for a weapon or a radio, but it didn't matter. He was off the call and already locking down the entry systems when the first police cruiser arrived. Too fast for coincidence. The deputy who emerged looked tense, but not hostile. He kept one hand near his belt, the other raised in a gesture that said he didn't want this to go sideways. Travis met him at the gate, unlocked it remotely, and stood on the porch with both hands visible. He wasn't stupid. He knew how quickly situations escalated when someone made assumptions, especially in a rural county where self-defense laws walked a razor's edge. The deputy asked if anyone had been harmed. Travis confirmed the tear gas discharge, the documented trespass, and the unlawful equipment use. He also showed the deputy the laminated notice of non-affiliation and cease access order posted on the gate, which had been torn, partway off, no doubt, by the man with the crowbar. The deputy took notes, reviewed the remaining footage, and requested to speak to the men in the SUVs. But by then, they were gone. Vehicles reversed and vanished within a 5-minute window after the gas triggered. That would have been the end of it, or so Travis thought. But later that day, a second cruiser returned, this time with 2 deputies and a man in a windbreaker marked District Liaison. He introduced himself as Gerald Pike and claimed that his office had received a formal complaint of hazardous material deployment within proximity to a shared roadway. Pike spoke with authority, but it was the wrong kind. His terminology was corporate, not civil. Travis didn't answer his questions. Instead, he called his attorney, placed the phone on speaker, and asked Pike to repeat the exact charge. Pike stumbled, clearly unprepared for legal confrontation, and tried to reframe his visit as an information-gathering courtesy. The lawyer shut it down immediately, reciting the penal codes relevant to stand your ground and controlled deterrent deployment. Pike backed off, mumbled something about needing further clarity, and left with the deputies. That evening, Travis rewatched the entire encounter from start to finish. He slowed the feed, captured stills of the license plates, the faces, the devices. Then he uploaded it all to an encrypted server and included a download link in an email to his legal team. The message was brief. They've stopped hiding. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He activated the off-grid perimeter, 6 mobile trail cams with heat and motion sensors, placed across the backwoods and fence lines, usually reserved for wildlife but now repurposed for something else. Each was synced to a silent mobile alert system and fitted with infrared filters that sent real-time stills to a separate account not linked to his primary devices. It wasn't paranoia, it was preemptive evidence control. Because if they returned, and they would, it wouldn't be for conversation. And when that happened, Travis needed more than a camera feed and a few shaky memories. He needed proof, and he needed control. That night, for the first time since the entire conflict had started, Travis sat at the edge of his bed, stared out the window toward the darkened gate, and understood something deeper than threats, trespass, or even legal authority. They weren't trying to convince him. They were trying to exhaust him. Travis had always known that control didn't mean preventing every problem before it happened. It meant being prepared enough that when the problem came, he wouldn't have to scramble. But preparation has limits, and even the most fortified man is vulnerable when attacked in ways that don't leave footprints on soil or fingerprints on steel. The morning after the gate assault, he received a formal notice via courier, not from the sheriff, not from the city, but from a regional engineering consultancy operating under the name Woodmere Development Services. The letter was polished, printed on heavy paper stock, and framed in legal language so dense and impersonal it might have come from a machine. The message, however, was straightforward. Travis's property was under consideration for reassessment due to public infrastructure adjustments, and the committee overseeing the process had identified his entry gate as a possible conflict point for projected routing. The implications were buried but unmistakable. They weren't going to try to buy him out. They were going to engineer him out. He didn't call anyone immediately. Instead, he left the house, walked the full length of his property border along the western line where the old deer fence used to stand before. He'd replaced it with pressure-treated posts and steel mesh. From that spot, he could see the sloped drainage basin that stretched down toward the highway. He knew every angle of this land, every grade, every runoff pattern. Nothing about this terrain suggested utility routing. There were easier ways to build, flatter areas with no resistance. No, this wasn't about public works. This was strategic friction, slow erosion through bureaucracy, weaponized process that wore you down, made you doubt what you knew, what you documented, what you could prove. It was subtle, but it was war. Back at the house, Travis contacted his legal team, forwarded the letter, and requested a full title search update, along with any recent activity on easements, plat filings, or right-of-way markers within a mile of his property. He didn't wait for a reply. Instead, he called a contact he hadn't spoken to in over a year, Dan Berenger, a licensed land use analyst who had previously worked with Travis's company when they were dealing with out-of-county industrial compliance contracts. Dan wasn't cheap, but he was thorough, and more importantly, he wasn't connected to the county. Travis explained the situation in clean, precise language, avoiding emotional framing. Dan listened, asked 2 technical questions about the terrain's hydrology and prior surveys, then agreed to visit the site in person the following afternoon. True to his word, Dan arrived in a dusty Tacoma with a trunk full of tools, topo maps, and surveying gear. He spent 5 hours walking the property with Travis, taking elevation readings, photographing slope contours, and marking areas of unnatural soil compression near the rear boundary. When they finished, Dan opened his laptop on the tailgate and overlaid Travis's parcel map against a digital layout of the county's public works plans from the past decade. Nothing matched. No existing project came close, but then Dan opened a second file. One compiled not from public data, but from filings made by a private developer operating under the shell entity Millbridge Acquisition Group. The file wasn't official, but it was real, and inside that file was a projection diagram. It showed a proposed private road, one that curved directly through the southern corner of Travis's property. Dan didn't speculate. He didn't need to. His expression was flat, his voice low. They're trying to get your gate off the books. Then they reclassify that corridor. Once it's marked inactive, they file for encroachment mitigation and claim compensation through arbitration. The land isn't taken, it's surrendered, and you're just supposed to watch it happen. Travis didn't reply. He took the tablet from Dan, studied the diagram, and quietly memorized the names of every listed stakeholder. He asked Dan for a full report, notarized and time-stamped. Dan promised to deliver it within 48 hours. Then Travis thanked him and paid him in cash. That evening, Travis received a call from his lawyer, confirming that a quiet title review had been initiated the day after the gate incident. Not by him, by a third party operating through a trustee. The move wasn't illegal, but it was aggressive. It meant someone was trying to cast doubt on his ownership records, likely to trigger a review period during which the county would freeze enforcement of certain property protections. It was, effectively, a pause button for those trying to get their foot in the door. Travis made no announcements. He simply took steps. He updated the registration on his perimeter security to reflect recent upgrades, then forwarded those documents to both his lawyer and the county engineering department, forcing them to acknowledge the presence of active infrastructure. He prepared a signed affidavit detailing the escalation timeline, had it notarized, and stored it with a third-party registrar. Finally, he contacted the same licensed surveyor who had certified the Gate Foundation years earlier and requested a re-inspection, not because anything had changed, but because having a second, recent verification on record would shut down most of the backdoor claims before they reached a courtroom. But the most telling moment didn't come from legal filings or technical overlays. It came the next morning, just after sunrise, when Travis stepped outside to check the main trail cam footage and noticed a pale smear across the northern edge of the gate. Something gray, faint, almost like ash. He walked closer. It wasn't ash. It was dust from cut stone, like someone had filed down a concrete edge nearby. He followed the faint trail 10 yards east and found the remnants of a plastic marker stake buried shallow in the gravel. It had no flag, no ID tag, but it had been there. Someone had tried to mark the land, likely at night, and, for reasons unknown, removed the flag but left the anchor. They were laying groundwork, literally, and Travis now understood that his gate wasn't the target. It was the first domino. The rain had barely let up when the second escalation arrived, not as an ambush, not as a confrontation, but as a performance. Travis had been expecting something, some response to the layers of resistance he'd put up, but even he hadn't predicted the sheer audacity of their next move. It was late afternoon, overcast, the kind of day where sound carried differently across the valley, softened by the wet ground but made clearer by the lack of wind. He was in the workshop fitting a new fuse box into the solar relay panel when the distant rumble of engines pulled his attention toward the road. By the time he made it outside and to the front porch, he saw them. A full-size flatbed truck hauling construction-grade fencing, a secondary box truck with no decals but Department of Transportation plates, and 2 utility vans idling side by side behind them like a security detail for a convoy. There was no warning, no notice, no contact, just motion, organized, deliberate, and brazen. They didn't come to the gate this time. Instead, the flatbed backed up and stopped directly across the easement on the neighboring property, a lot that had sat undeveloped for years and had recently, according to his lawyer, changed hands through an anonymous land trust. Men got out, 6 in total, wearing high-visibility vests, hard hats, and carrying clipboards. But these weren't municipal contractors. Their body language was too stiff, too watchful, and they moved in a way that made it obvious they weren't unfamiliar with surveillance. One of them pulled a tripod-mounted laser transit from the van and began setting up a visual line across the open area that edged Travis's south fence. Another drove steel rods into the ground with a compact mallet, tapping them gently into the moist dirt, marking a line that just barely skirted the legal boundary. Barely. Travis watched from the tree line, half hidden among the sycamores, binoculars resting on a moss-covered stump. He wasn't paranoid. He didn't need to be. This wasn't cloak and dagger. This was a pressure campaign conducted in daylight. They weren't hiding. They were daring him to overstep, and they were counting on him reacting, emotionally, storming down the hill, shouting about property lines and legal threats. But he didn't move. He took photos. Then he returned to the house and began making calls. His lawyer picked up on the second ring, and before Travis could finish his sentence, he was already requesting copies of any recent construction permits filed for adjacent lots. In the meantime, Travis opened the county's public planning portal and began combing through recent activity logs. The lot across from his southern fence had indeed been registered for development, but not residential. The permit referenced an agricultural machinery storage facility, which made little sense given the terrain. More interestingly, the filing had been categorized under Emergency Ordinance 49C, a provision allowing certain developments to bypass public comment periods if classified as time-sensitive infrastructure, contributing to regional support capacity. Travis had only seen it used once before, years ago, when a waste management site had lobbied to install a temporary transfer station during a flood event. That this clause was being used for what amounted to private construction was a red flag in itself. Still, nothing illegal had occurred. Not yet, but the message was unmistakable. They weren't just testing boundaries anymore. They were building around him, laying the foundation, literally and procedurally, for an encirclement. Not a fence, not a wall, a context, a narrative. If they could surround him with utility infrastructure, they could argue that his gate and the system behind it posed a risk to operational continuity, a safety hazard, an obstruction, and once that designation was formally proposed, they could file an injunction. All of it legal, all of it slow, all of it aimed at breaking his will, not his locks. But what they didn't account for was how much patience Travis had when it came to defending something that was his. He spent the next 2 days in near total silence, venturing into town only once to purchase additional memory cards and a second ruggedized trail cam with a longer infrared range. Every step he took was calculated. He moved his primary recording server off-site, linked all video backups to a rotating cloud loop encrypted through his lawyer's secure archive, and began documenting every new arrival, every vehicle plate, every delivery made to the lot across the road. And yet the silence continued. No one addressed him directly. No new complaints. Just the slow, steady presence of activity meant to frame his gate, and by extension his resistance, as incompatible with the emerging purpose of the surrounding area. That purpose revealed itself 4 days later when he discovered the power tap. It was early evening, still bright enough to work without a flashlight, when he noticed a drop in output on his shed's solar monitor. A minor issue, something that usually meant dust on the panels or a loose diode in the power bank. But as he traced the line from the panel to the inverter, he found something else. A thin, black cable, coaxial, wrapped in weatherproof sheathing, spliced directly into his main conduit and buried hastily beneath a foot of gravel. It ran under the eastern fence, not through it, and curved out of sight toward the same lot where the trucks had parked. Someone had tapped his power supply, not to steal energy but to justify presence. If challenged, they'd claim a need for temporary support while grid work was conducted. Maybe even suggest that Travis had granted informal permission, or that it was unavoidable during regional upgrades. He didn't touch the cable. Not yet. He documented it, took soil samples, photographed the splice, and placed a flagged marker next to the conduit in case someone tried to retrieve or disguise it later. Then he contacted his lawyer, who began drafting a cease and desist letter paired with a formal declaration of interference. He also reached out to a certified electrical inspector and arranged for an emergency site survey. If anyone tried to dispute the source, he'd have third-party verification within 48 hours. But something in Travis shifted that evening. Not his resolve, that remained intact, but the weight of what he was now dealing with. It wasn't just intimidation or legal manipulation. It was coordinated, strategic aggression executed through proxies and bureaucratic sleight of hand. They weren't trying to break in. They were trying to make him look like the one out of place, and if they succeeded in creating that perception, then every lawful action he took could be reframed as obstructionist, antagonistic, even dangerous. And they came closer to that than he expected. The next morning, just after sunrise, he stepped outside to find a county vehicle parked at the base of his drive. The deputy who emerged was younger, unfamiliar, and clearly uncomfortable. His approach was slow, respectful, but hesitant. He explained that he was following up on an anonymous report of unregistered deterrent devices being installed on residential property. He wasn't there to arrest anyone, just to ask questions and verify claims. Travis didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He invited the deputy to view the gate system from a distance, provided the documentation for every certified component, including the gas release system, and offered a printed copy of the registration filed 6 months earlier. The deputy accepted the paperwork, made a few notes, and left after confirming that nothing illegal had occurred. But the visit wasn't the point. The timing was. It had been coordinated to follow the power tap, a chain reaction. First interference, then an anonymous tip, then a recorded visit, all framed to imply that Travis's defenses weren't just private, but questionable. And once those doubts were in the system, the next visit would be easier, more formal, more forceful. That night he didn't sleep, not out of fear, out of certainty. They were preparing something, and next time they wouldn't send a deputy, they'd send a team. It was on the 8th morning after the deputy's visit that the escalation finally ruptured into full confrontation, not through shouting or a sudden break-in, but through something colder and far more deliberate, official equipment on unofficial ground. Travis had just returned from the South Line, where he'd spent 2 hours rechecking every marker placed by Dan Behringer during the survey. Nothing had moved. The terrain had held. But as he rounded the western slope and came into view of his own entrance road, he stopped mid-step, his boots digging slightly into the wet grass. There, standing directly across from his reinforced gate, was a modular construction barrier. Fiberglass panels bolted to steel framing, the type used to mark the perimeter of active dig sites. Behind it stood a yellow compact excavator, idling, its arm draped lazily across a patch of gravel that hadn't existed the day before, and standing next to the machine, clipboard in hand, was a woman he'd never seen before. She was dressed like a project manager, high-vis vest over a tailored black windbreaker, sunglasses even in the overcast light, and a tablet holster slung over one shoulder like a sidearm. Behind her, 4 workers in unmarked utility uniforms milled around without speaking. No flagging tape, no posted notices, no signage declaring a project number or permit number, just equipment and posture and the kind of silence that comes from people doing something they know might not hold up under scrutiny. Travis didn't approach immediately. He circled wide, using a blind spot he'd long ago marked in his own security grid, and came around through a back trail that let him watch from a cluster of low cedar growth. He counted the trucks. 3. 2 with trailer beds carrying cable spools and steel mesh. 1 box truck with no license plate on the rear, just a white rectangle where the screws had been removed. The woman said something into a headset. Moments later, one of the workers pulled out a metal stake and began hammering it into the dirt, less than 6 feet from Travis's boundary post. That was all he needed. He stepped out from the cedar line, boots crunching just enough to draw attention but not enough to be mistaken for hesitation. The woman turned first. She didn't flinch, didn't move. She just straightened, set her clipboard down, and waited. Travis spoke clearly, firmly, but without raising his voice. "You're trespassing on contested land. I have documents on file and 2 notarized surveys confirming this boundary. You have 60 seconds to back off and stop all activity." The woman smiled without warmth. "We're operating under emergency code provisions authorized by county oversight. You'll need to file a challenge through the Dispute Resolution Office." Travis didn't move. "I've already filed 3 challenges. I've received no responses. This isn't sanctioned." She gestured to the excavator behind her. "Site preparation began this morning. You're welcome to contact your attorney." He already had. His phone was in his pocket, set to auto dial. He tapped it without breaking eye contact, then slowly raised his left hand and pointed toward the cable spool nearest his property. "If that line crosses into my parcel, it's grounds for immediate injunction. My cameras are recording, and I have third-party verification standing by." One of the workers paused, looked to the woman. She said nothing, just nodded, and that was when things broke. The excavator's operator, perhaps unaware of the standoff or perhaps directed to continue regardless, lowered the arm and began dragging the bucket toward the ground. The blade caught the gravel with a loud scrape, and for a second the tension broke into movement. Travis stepped forward. The woman moved in response, and from behind the utility van 2 men appeared, bigger, bulkier, wearing gear that didn't match the rest of the crew. One of them had a visible holster. The other had a radio and a palm-sized device Travis recognized immediately, a field jammer. He stepped back once, slow and deliberate, pulling the phone from his pocket and raising it to shoulder level. "This interaction is being recorded under active legal notice," he said aloud, louder this time, projecting. "Any tampering with my signal or system will be treated as criminal interference." The man with the device raised it anyway. He clicked something. The signal in Travis's earpiece died. The call dropped. The network vanished, and then the lights at the gate flashed red. They hadn't touched the structure yet, but something had breached the secondary sensor line. Maybe from ground pressure, maybe from the EMI pulse. It didn't matter. The system didn't rely on full contact. It had been configured weeks ago to respond to coordinated signal loss paired with perimeter intrusion. A narrow alert zone fired off in a half-circle sweep, releasing a tiered stream of vaporized deterrent gas, non-lethal, legally certified, but enough to cause panic. The wind carried it fast. The closest worker fell to his knees. The man with the jammer turned, stumbled back, coughing. The woman shouted something, no words, just direction, and the men began retreating toward the trucks. Travis didn't move. He kept filming. Then, once the machines began to reverse, he pulled out his emergency signal beacon, the one linked to the sheriff's direct dispatch node, and triggered it with a sharp click of his thumb. By the time the first cruiser arrived, the vehicles were already pulling away. Not speeding, not panicking, just vacating, like actors leaving a stage the moment the lights come up. The woman was the last aboard. She met Travis's eyes across the gravel one last time before stepping into the cab of the lead truck and vanishing down the road. The deputy who approached didn't smile. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at the churned-up dirt, the marker rods still lodged in the ground, the residue hanging faint in the air. Then he pulled out a notepad. Travis didn't answer questions. He made a statement. He handed over the footage. He provided the packet from Dan Behringer, the power tap evidence, the filed complaints, the time-stamped alerts, the photographs. And when the deputy asked if anyone had entered his land physically, Travis nodded and pointed to the boot prints less than 2 feet past the fence line. It wasn't over. But something had changed. They had been caught mid-play, exposed in the act, and now the only thing protecting them from full legal exposure was the murkiness of intent. But Travis knew the system well enough to understand that murkiness wouldn't protect them forever. For the first time, the burden of proof had shifted, and it wasn't on him anymore. The days that followed the confrontation weren't quiet, but they were different. Something in the tempo of the opposition had broken, like an engine slipping into a lower gear after pushing too hard too fast. No new crews arrived, no more trucks appeared at the edge of his property, and the silence that returned wasn't the tense kind that warned of ambush. It was the hollow pause that follows exposure when those behind the curtain retreat just far enough to reassess how visible they've become. Travis didn't mistake the absence of action for surrender. He knew better. He moved through the following week with the precision of someone who had already outlived the expectation of reaction. Every camera remained online. The motion sensors were recalibrated and tested daily. His legal team continued pushing forward with documented filings, including a comprehensive complaint against the unpermitted cable splice, the illegal attempt at rerouting infrastructure, and the unauthorized use of personal land for staging. The evidence package was substantial. Hundreds of megabytes of video, photographs, license records, and notarized third-party surveys. Clean, chronological, and unassailable. When his attorney submitted it to the Office of Property Enforcement, he did so under a formal request for a regional injunction, not just to protect Travis's land, but to suspend all adjacent development activities until a full review could be conducted. It was the kind of move that only worked when timing and documentation aligned perfectly, and this time they did. Within 48 hours, the county issued a provisional freeze on all construction permits tied to Millbridge Acquisition Group and its associated shells. The surveyor's report alone was enough to trigger an internal audit on the original land transfers, revealing several procedural inconsistencies in how the lots surrounding Travis had been reclassified. By the end of the week, the audit had ballooned into a formal investigation, and key members of the committee that had first targeted his gate were subpoenaed for depositions. Travis didn't watch the hearings. He didn't read the articles that followed when local blogs picked up the story and began piecing together the timeline. He didn't need the validation. He had never built his defense for the sake of audience or sympathy. He had built it to last. What mattered to him was that the pressure stopped, not from exhaustion, not because he fought harder, but because they finally hit a wall they couldn't maneuver around. Process, proof, and persistence. Not once had he escalated outside the system. Not once had he taken the bait and turned the confrontation into something reckless. And in the end, it wasn't the gate that protected his land. It was his refusal to let anyone redefine it. Weeks passed. The signs of construction vanished. The barriers across the street were dismantled under quiet orders, and the lot returned to silence, its permit withdrawn and its status changed back to unoccupied. One morning, as Travis checked the motion logs before coffee, he noticed a county truck parked at the far edge of the property. A lone inspector stepped out, clipboard in hand, and walked the fence line without crossing it. When he reached the front, he placed a small metal stake into the dirt. No flag, no warning color, just a subtle stainless steel marker engraved with a county code and a date. Travis read it later that day and saw what he needed. The parcel had been reaffirmed as private, undisturbed, and beyond jurisdictional dispute. There was no parade, no public vindication, just the quiet return of what had been his from the beginning. He didn't remove the gate. He didn't strip away the tear gas system, but he did replace the old warning sign with something cleaner, etched into a brushed aluminum plate and bolted to the stone column beside the keypad. It didn't threaten. It didn't posture. It simply said, "Secured property. No entry without consent. This boundary is final." And then he went back to work. The brush still needed clearing. The north shed still needed new wiring. And the land, as always, waited, not for defense but for attention, respect, and someone willing to stand for it without needing to be seen doing so.